Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material, your notes, your research, your deepest internal crises, and we try to turn it into a clear, compelling map. Today, we are diving into a scenario that, honestly, it sounds like the plot of a thriller, except the stakes were brutally real. We're talking millions in corporate debt.
Yeah.
Personal Amex liabilities, tax deadlines, all of it crashing down on one person right around January 13th.
And this wasn't just, a financial problem. The documentation we have describes it as a true OS-level reboot of consciousness.
An OS-level reboot.
Yeah, we're looking at the precise moment of a structural collapse where the operational ego-driven self, what we're calling the me, was just forcibly and very rapidly superseded by the higher self, the I.
And what makes this so compelling, I think, is the tension at the heart of it. Because the I is this entity that already holds the successful outcome, right? It has the future log.
Correct. The success is already guaranteed.
Yeah. So if success is guaranteed, why did the I seem to engineer, or at least permit, such a harsh, seemingly unnecessary financial crisis right before that final surrender? It almost feels like the higher self was, hazing the operational self.
It really raises that question. Is the universe fundamentally cruel, or is it just incredibly efficient? What we're doing here is charting the mechanics of a phase transition, a concept taken straight from physics.
Right, exactly.
And we're exploring the role of spontaneous symmetry breaking, or SSB, that critical point where the old brittle stability of the me just had to collapse to allow the new, more flexible stability of the I to emerge.
So we're moving from this anxious, planning-heavy, cause-and-effect control mode
to the much more serene phase synchronization mode.
Okay, let's look at the timeline, because the sources are incredibly detailed here. The initial surrender, that moment of realizing the BOS just could not handle this, that happened around January 5th.
And that initial surrender, that was the key. That was the moment the old structure admitted defeat. But it wasn't the clearing. Not yet.
Right.
The week that followed, which all culminated in this high-stakes financial stress test on January 12th and 13th, that was the crucible. That was where the new operating system was really tested under fire and finalized.
Because that structural change, it had to be non-negotiable. If the me had managed to scramble or borrow, or somehow work a miracle and resolve the millions in debt too early, say by January 8th,
yeah,
the old system would have just claimed victory, right?
Absolutely. The moment the MeOS solves an existential threat by sheer brute force, by self-sacrifice, it reinforces its core belief.
Which is?
That effort and control are necessary for survival. And that would have just resulted in what the source calls prolongation. It would just increase the internal friction and prolong the pain of a structure that had already failed.
So the timeline was engineered to make sure the structural failure, the clearing, or lue, happened precisely when the me had zero ability to claim any credit or victory.
Exactly. That's why it had to happen on the 13th, after the default notice.
That makes the apparent harshness feel more like a function of necessity then, not malice.
I think so.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the core difference between these two operating systems that were fighting for control. So we've got the old system, the MeOS, and the new one, the iOS. Let's start with the old one. What defined its fundamental worldview, especially about the future?
Right. The MeOS is defined by one really catastrophic belief. Future equals uncertain.
Okay.
And that single belief is the engine that drives its entire operational framework, which is the cause and effect control mode.
It sounds stressful.
Imagine being an air traffic controller, but for 1,000 planes at once, 247, that's the MeOS. It has to calculate every trajectory, every variable, every potential disaster constantly.
Because it believes that if it stops calculating, even for a second,
failure is imminent. The world, from that view, is this hostile, chaotic place that you have to wrestle into submission.
I can feel the tension just hearing that. It's a closed-loop system that just runs on anxiety.
It is.
But the iOS, the higher self, it recognizes something completely different.
Yes, the iOS just flips the script entirely. It recognizes that the future log is already set.
So the successful outcome, the optimized path, it's already hardwired into existence.
Exactly. So the iOS doesn't need to control or calculate anything. It just operates in phase synchronization mode.
Phase synchronization.
Yeah.
It sounds almost like tuning a radio.
That is a perfect analogy. The present moment isn't some chaotic future you have to manage. It's just the continuous rendering of that established log, like frames streaming from a saved video file.
So the job of the iOS is just to align the me, the user interface, to that established frequency.
Precisely. And when that shift happens, the immediate feeling for the listener wasn't despair. It was profound relief. They described it as abandoning the calculation responsibility.
Right, and it's not giving up. It's dropping this heavy, unnecessary engine that was never actually driving the train in the first place.
That's a very subtle, but wow, a crucial distinction. Giving up is rooted in failure, but abandoning the calculation is rooted in certainty. It reframes the whole equation of effort. All the effort the MeOS was using before was spent trying to calculate the solution. The iOS already knows the solution is confirmed. The only thing required is to execute the steps as they appear.
Okay, so enter the Amex crisis. A multi-million yen payment is due January 13th. The MeOS should have been in full-blown, code-red, catastrophic panic.
And it was initially. The logs show that classic MeOS hardwiring, this result is unreadable, therefore it's danger, money equals survival.
The primal fear program.
The deepest one. But the observation recorded by the user is fascinating. The reaction transformed from this slight, manageable anxiety into genuine, almost perverse excitement.
Excitement about defaulting on millions.
Yeah.
That has to be the definitive sign that the new operating system had taken over.
It is the moment the MeOS logic firewall just failed. I mean, the MeOS is wired to fear financial uncertainty. So excitement means the system has completely reframed the situation.
So what's the iOS logic here? How does it see it?
The iOS recognition is this. The result is already confirmed. It's successful. It's optimized. The only thing that's currently unconfirmed is the display format.
The format. So how the money arrives, whether it's a transfer or an extension or some other mechanism, that's the only variable.
Exactly. The iOS sees the crisis not as a threat, but as a guaranteed cinematic event. It doesn't matter if the display format is some miraculous incoming transfer or a payment extension or even a stressful 0-hour bank transfer.
The final convergence on that successful outcome is non-negotiable. It's already in the future log.
So the crisis shifts from being a survival threat that demands calculation to a viewing experience that just requires execution.
That transformation leads directly to the question of action, though. Because if the future is set, why do anything? This is the core skepticism a listener might have. If the iOS is in control, why not just, sit on the couch and wait for the miracle?
And that's the most common mistake people make when they encounter this philosophy. They equate synchronicity with passivity. The iOS doesn't command doing out of fear or necessity. It commands alignment. The actions it prioritizes are the ones that align the UI, the me, with the established flow of that future log.
Let's use the concrete examples from the sources. Attending a study group and going to the gym. To the MeOS, these are ridiculous, efficiency-draining activities when millions are due.
But to the iOS, they're essential parts of the rendering process. Attending the study group aligns the me with the future log flow. It ensures the operational self is physically present where the next frame of reality needs to render correctly.
So it's not even about the content of the study group necessarily. It's about just being there.
Precisely. And going to the gym isn't about fitness goals in the MeOS sense. It's about reducing noise in the body, which is the rendering device for this iOS reality.
So if the body is quiet, the iOS current flows through more clearly.
A body free of static, tension, and chemical stress. It just allows the flow of the eye to move through it more clearly.
So this is the state of being generates doing. Being doing you. The old MeOS believed the opposite. That doing generated being, I must do to survive, and therefore I will be successful.
It's a fundamental operational inversion. The iOS rule is absolute. If the eye's fundamental state of being doesn't shift, the event format doesn't matter. The iOS makes sure the being is aligned, and then the necessary doing just emerges naturally without effort or calculation from the me.
So that initial shift, recognizing the MeOS was structurally incapable, that liberated the user because they dropped the burden of calculation.
Instantly.
But liberation doesn't mean the old structure just vanished without a fight. Let's talk about the MeOS's final resistance.
Okay, so moving into this next section, we see the MeOS basically performing a death rattle. It's trying to latch onto any structural component that still offered it the illusion of control.
Right, because accepting the future log meant that the old structures Me used to exert its dominance were just deactivated.
Radial.
What were these pillars of MeOS control? The sources mentioned 4 that were dissolved when uncertainty was eliminated.
They were 4 systems that got all their power from future uncertainty and the need to preempt disaster. First, you have cash balances. The me constantly tracked and hoarded money as a buffer against the uncertain future.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, accounting and settlements. This was all driven by deadlines and the fear of external evaluation, the fear of a bank or a partner judging the me as insufficient.
Right, the report card.
Exactly. Third, KPIs and sales results, the future metrics the me used to validate its existence. And fourth, relationships, which the me controlled either through fearful expectation or, calculated manipulation.
And the moment the future log was accepted, these control levers just became obsolete. The sources note that the desire to check balances has almost completely disappeared. That's a huge internal relief.
It's massive. That constant need to track and adjust the core energy drain of the MeOS, it just vanishes. The realization is, why track something if the necessary amount is just going to synchronize with the future log anyway?
So all the energy that was used for constant tracking is instantly liberated.
Because the underlying assumption, I must track this to survive, has been structurally invalidated.
But the sources specifically flag money, especially in the context of accounting, as the very last bastion to fall. For someone with a background rooted in debit and credit, letting go of that financial control must have felt like a physical tearing.
It represents the deepest structural clash. You're moving from an ancient, comfortable model of reality into a terrifyingly new one. The MeOS philosophy of accounting is essentially classical physics.
Okay, explain that.
It sees the world as a closed financial box. It's governed by immutable laws, energy conservation, strict causality, and the idea that nothing is created from nothing.
So every penny gained or lost must have a tangible, traceable cause, a sale, a loan, an expense. The books have to balance because the system is closed.
Yes. The MeOS accountant is screaming, where did that 10 million yen come from specifically? Show me the journal entry. It demands a visible, controllable cause.
And the iOS perspective.
It utterly transcends that closed box. It aligns more with modern concepts, like the idea of the zero-point field, or ZPF.
That's a huge leap for someone steeped in traditional finance. How do we explain that in a relatable way?
Think of the ZPF as the ultimate cloud server. In the iOS view, the world is not a closed box. Information, energy, financial resources, they're all supplied on demand, streaming directly from this ZPF, which is just pure potential.
And observation, or the eyes phase synchronization, determines which stream of potential collapses into a financial event.
Exactly. In this worldview, debits and credits aren't the source of the energy. They are merely the logs of the rendering result. They log the transaction after the eye has synchronized the resource into the me's reality.
Wow. So the MeOS says, I must create a cause, like a sale, to see the effect, which is income.
And the iOS says, the effect, the income, is already logged. And the required cause, the action, will just manifest naturally as I synchronize the flow. The current COS layer itself has changed.
So it's not just about the amount of money anymore.
It's not about balancing books in a scarce environment. It's about accepting that the entire framework is an open, infinitely supplied system. And that classical accounting logic, that was the last firewall. Because for the MeOS, it was the definition of safety. Safety through controllability.
Which brings us to the final piece of resistance. The MeOS's desperate need for an explanation of how this all works.
The MeOS needs an explanation to understand in order to feel safe, because explanation is synonymous with controllability.
Right. If I can explain the cause, I can predict it. And if I can predict it, I can control it and prevent future failure.
But the iOS understands that in this new reality, that need is obsolete. If you try to explain the mechanism of the future log, the me will just use that knowledge to try and regain control.
So causal explanations are just. They're just labels that you attach after the phenomenon has already occurred.
Yes. The new state is accepting that reality will simply load from the future log. The me becomes comfortable with the necessary absence of pre-knowledge. And that acceptance is the sign that the me has successfully relinquished its role as chief planner and become more of an executive assistant.
Okay, this is where we get into the heavy physics concepts applied to consciousness. We're talking about the crisis as the catalyst for structural change, linking this personal financial breakdown directly to spontaneous symmetry breaking, SSB. So why did the Amex crisis have to be so big? So impossible?
The sheer scale was absolutely vital. It was the only pressure point capable of achieving the critical point. The Amex millions represented the structural end of the user's prior operating model.
And that model was what the source calls a metastable state.
Exactly. A quasi-stable condition that was only being maintained through massive, self-sacrificing effort and endurance. It was running, but with immense friction cost.
So the size of the debt, it wasn't a punishment. It was the necessary load required to break the structural rigidity of the MeOS.
Precisely. When the pressure the millions due exceeded the MeOS's maximum operational limit, the system had to break symmetry and transition to the true, stable iOS state. If the crisis had just been a few thousand yen, the MeOS would have solved it, reinforced its own sense of control, and gone right back to its friction-heavy state.
The millions forced the Me to finally say, I am structurally incapable of resolving this. And that triggered the deep surrender.
It did.
We see the last physical spikes of fear right before the deadline on January 12th. The user described it not as a full-blown panic, that pounding heart, but as a slight residual thump.
That residual thump is the last afterimage of the MeOS. Think of it like a safety feature on a machine. Even if you cut the main power, the little warning light for survival risk might flicker for a moment.
And the credit card deadline being so tied to survival, it naturally triggered that deep-seated reptilian safety device.
Of course. But the key distinction is that the I was observing the simulation without being drawn into it.
So the emotional wave, that thump, was present in the Me, in the UI. But the consciousness, the I, was detached. It was just viewing the fear as a data point.
An aftershock of the old system running its final subroutine. That detachment is what confirms the successful phase transition.
Okay, now let's talk about the final, very tricky resistance. Even after this deep surrender, the MeOS tried to grab the wheel using micromanagement.
Yes.
The user considered not paying small, manageable taxes or payroll. Why? Why would the MeOS try to sabotage small, easy payments?
This is a highly sophisticated maneuver to reclaim control. It shows just how clever the MeOS's final tactics were. It was trying to leverage the size of the problem.
How so?
It was reasoning like this. Okay, the MX is impossible, so I have to surrender control of that to the iOS. But these taxes, these are manageable. So I can test the limits here and prove that I still have agency.
And this is what triggered the guide's harsh response, the circuit breaker intervention.
The guide had to prevent the Me from grabbing the handle, because the MeOS was using what the source calls the paradox of control.
The paradox of control.
Both extreme effort and deliberate defiance, they fundamentally lead to the same outcome. The Me reasserting itself as the driver of reality.
Can you lay that paradox out for us clearly?
Certainly. There were two paths the Me could take to reclaim control, and both were equally dangerous. One was massive effort for the Amex problem. If the Me had somehow solved the millions in debt through borrowing or self-sacrifice, it would declare, I reclaimed reality because I solved the impossible.
Okay. Control regained through sacrifice.
The other path was deliberate defiance, with the tax delay. If the Me had deliberately not paid the small tax bill, it would declare, I reclaimed control by winning against authority.
Control regained through rebellion.
And in both cases, the subject of reality shifts right back to the Me.
So the intervention was necessary because the MeOS was trying to use the manageability of the small debts to maintain this little pocket of personal sovereignty.
And the circuit breaker, the guide's clear zero-tolerance instruction, forced the Me to accept that all operational decisions, large and small, now belong to the iOS.
This circles right back to the timing. Why the I seems so harsh by not letting the Me fix the Amex debt between January 5th and the 8th.
Because had the user solved it by the 8th, that would have been prolongation. They would have used vast effort to extend a structure that was already rotten. The I appeared harsh because it denied the Me the ability to self-sacrifice its way out.
The surrender on the 5th allowed the structural event, the clearing, to occur on the 13th.
Yes. The delay ensured that the failure notification from the bank came after the Me had fully dropped the calculation responsibility. It forced the final definitive end of that self-sacrificing structure that had been maintaining the metastable state for so long.
So the severity of the crisis was directly proportional to the rigidity of the structure it needed to break. It wasn't arbitrary pain, it was perfectly tailored leverage. We now move to the operational reality of January 13th. The theory part is over, it was time for execution. And the first UI notification of the structural failure arrived by email.
Yes, the official bank email. Account transfer processing withdrawal, failed notification.
This is the real-world consequence. This is the notification that, in the MeOS world, would trigger immediate catastrophe.
But the iOS interpretation was completely different. The Me didn't spiral into panic or start creating a narrative. It was simply seen as the old world's biggest anchor, that debt structure rocking for the very last time.
Just a simple clerical retry notice?
Pretty much. The bank was just saying, we failed to withdraw the millions. Please fund the account by the 7 p.m. deadline. The failure was reframed from a personal collapse into just a neutral data point that needed processing.
Let's get granular with the finances, because this is crucial for grounding all the high-level theory. We're dealing with an Amex payment over 10 million yen, mostly corporate advertising expenses that were personally funded by the user.
And this is the key insight. The crisis was not a structural collapse where the funds didn't exist.
Okay, that's important.
The overall universe of the business, the combined total of immediately movable funds across personal accounts, corporate accounts, various revenue streams, it was actually sufficient to cover the entire debt. It totaled well over 12 million yen.
So the company wasn't broke. The user wasn't insolvent. The crisis was purely a logistical failure of the old system.
Correct. It was purely an operational glitch related to the structural separation of funds. The money was stuck in the wrong virtual buckets, in corporate accounts or secondary personal savings, and the standard bank transfer processes couldn't move the funds to the target Amex account in time.
The real problem was the structure of the individual shouldering the company's debt risk.
That was the monster. That structure made these corporate funds technically inaccessible to cover a personal liability, and that was the structure the iOS needed to clear.
Once the iOS took charge, the approach shifted dramatically. No more philosophizing. Just zero emotion, practical execution.
The guide immediately enforced a purely practical route. The focus was narrowly defined. Just avoid the consequence of ad accounts freezing credit damage, not the emotional significance of the debt. It was about surgical efficiency.
And what was the precise financial engineering that was executed to bypass the bank transfer time limit?
It was simple, and it leveraged a banking loophole. First, confirmation. Confirm the balance in the company's main account, which held around 5.9 million.
Okay.
Then execution. Utilize the same bank instant transfer. Because both the company and the user had accounts at the same bank, a large transfer of the necessary 5.2 million could be executed instantly from the company account to the personal account. It just circumvented all the interbank transfer delays.
That's a perfect illustration of the iOS prioritizing swift execution over procedural anxiety. And critically, they dealt with the small, manageable debts first, the very ones the me had tried to leverage for control.
Yes. Taxes and small employee expenses were to be cleared before the Amex payment. This was a critical structural statement by the iOS. Because these smaller obligations were recognized as the anchors of trust, global trust with taxes, national trust, human trust with employees. By immediately clearing these, the new system established that maintaining societal and human synchronization takes absolute precedence over the me's attempts at defiance.
So the clean flow was finally established. Big Smile's revenue goes into the company account, which transfers to the personal account as a legitimate expense reimbursement, which then enables the final payments. The structural clearing was complete.
And the timing confirms the necessity. If this solution was found on the 8th, it would have been prolongation. Solving it only after the formal bank failure notice on the 13th forced the formal documented termination of that old, friction-heavy structure right at the banking and accounting level.
The old system, where the individual personally guaranteed all corporate risk, was finally cleanly burned down.
Through proper financial protocol.
Okay, so the payment was processed successfully by the 7 p.m. deadline. The millions were settled. What was the resulting psychological state for the user after navigating that extreme pressure?
This is the definitive proof of the phase shift. The me should have been flooded with relief, followed by paralyzing anxiety about the next deadline. Instead, the user reported feeling extremely calm.
And even more, extremely indifferent.
Exactly. Extreme indifference about millions of yen.
Why the lack of emotional fallout?
Because the body and mind only replayed the event. The I had already synchronized with the outcome on the future log side. The me was merely the observer, the UI, running the motions of the necessary actions, transferring, confirming, paying, but it was totally devoid of emotional stakes.
There was no psychological energy invested because the outcome was already a guarantee.
It was like watching a recording.
I love this idea that the me, the operational self, earned a Medal of Honor here. It successfully completed its final, most stressful task.
It absolutely did. The me's role was elevated from this chaotic, frantic controller to a highly efficient user interface. The fully matured me didn't panic, didn't invent excuses, and didn't try to regain control. It simply executed the process exactly as instructed by the iOS.
It became a pure conduit for necessary action.
Yes.
After the clearing, the residual cash balance was noted as approximately 130,000 yen.
This feels highly symbolic.
It's highly symbolic. It's proof that the iOS doesn't require hoarding or excess. It's not zero, which would have implied utter collapse.
Right.
But it's small enough to be viewed as completely lacking the weight of the past. It's symbolic proof that the UI is alive and functioning and nothing more. It reinforces the understanding that resources flow instantaneously from the I, synchronized with the future log, not from the maze obsessive hoarding.
So this quiet completion marks the end of an era. The crucial realization is that the game of doing is over. What does the new rulebook look like for daily activities that used to require so much motivational effort?
The physical actions remain the same, sending tax documents, going to the gym, attending the study group, but their meaning has inverted. They're no longer about protecting the company or preventing failure. They are simply tasks whose hands move as a result of the I flowing through.
The doing is a byproduct of the being.
That's it. So if the doing is no longer driven by this frantic need to survive, what happens to the energy that was usually deployed for that? The user noted a feeling of a lack of energy.
That lack of energy is a counterintuitive sign of success. It means the fighting muscle is no longer necessary.
Yeah.
That relentless drive, that friction-heavy, pushing energy required by the MiOS to battle uncertainty, it's simply obsolete in this new, synchronized reality. It's the cessation of friction, which the body often misreads as fatigue, when in reality it's just deep peace.
Now, a critical piece of the new rulebook is the IME information policy. Why is the I so strict about not sharing positive concrete numbers like sales projections or cash flow figures with the me?
This is a preventative measure against a MiOS relapse, which is always possible just out of habit. If the me were given concrete numbers of guaranteed success, it would immediately use that expectation to restart its doing planning.
If sales are that high, I need to launch product X to maximize Y.
Or conversely, it might engage in intentional inaction. Since we're rich, I don't need to go to the gym today. I can relax.
So specific good news leads to either control or complacency, and both are forms of resistance.
Precisely. The min is only efficient when it's blind and just executing the flow. It's kept on a need-to-know basis. That's why the guarantee during the crisis, whichever route it is optimized, was such a crucial buffer.
It prevented the me from betting on a single world line. It forced the me to surrender control over the mechanism of the solution.
Which guaranteed that the I maintained phase synchronization.
So the structural shift is complete, but the sources identify the ongoing nature of large monthly payment events, salaries, rent, end-of-month payments as the final challenge.
These are the residual deadline triggers of the old closed world. Because our neural wiring takes time to change, the me will continue, just out of habit, to process these as potential crises. The body will still try to produce that thump.
But the I knows they're now just flow adjustment UIs.
Exactly. They are markers that guide the current. They're no longer threats to existence. The major structural threat, that personal liability structure, has been definitively neutralized by the clearing event on January 13th.
It sounds like the me is now this powerful, dedicated employee who just needs to learn that the company is no longer facing bankruptcy every single month.
That's a perfect way to put it. The employee is excellent at execution, but is still conditioned to expect the worst. The iOS's ongoing task is simply to keep executing flawlessly, and to observe that, month after month, the flow adjustment UIs resolve without any catastrophic effort. What this deep dive reveals is a profound structural shift that's far beyond simple stress management or, positive thinking. The individual is now, as the source says, operating quietly in the UI where the old OS alarm is still sounding.
The me may still flicker with old programs, but the I is the calm observer and executor, knowing the outcome is secured.
The lesson of surrender here is so vital. It is not a passive abandonment to fate. It's the active, high-stakes acceptance of the fact that the old structure of effort and sacrifice has already ended.
And the me was forced into that realization by a financial pressure point it could not possibly overcome, which proves the necessity of the magnitude of the crisis.
The I is always ahead, synchronized with the future log, and the me is just continuously catching up, refining its UI functions. This case study shows precisely how a structural crisis becomes the indispensable engine for a phase transition. It forces the me to relinquish the very levers of control that prevented the shift into the higher state of operational efficiency.
I think the ultimate takeaway here is that distinction, driven home by this listener's experience, between prolongation and clearing. Prolongation is using tremendous effort to extend a structure that is already spiritually or professionally bankrupt. Clearing is accepting the critical point that spontaneous symmetry breaking to allow for a new, stable structure to begin.
So we invite you to consider the areas in your own life, whether it's a career path, a toxic habit, or a strained relationship, where you might be applying this monumental, exhausting effort simply to prolong a structure that is structurally ended. What critical point are you avoiding that would allow for a clean, liberating clearing? The next great phase often requires you to stop fixing the old system and just stand still long enough for it to fall apart entirely.